For centuries before the arrival of white men in the Pacific Northwest, numerous Native American tribes shared the abundant natural environment of the Rocky Mountains and the Columbia River Plateau. The Salish-speaking of these tribes included the Flatheads, Kalispels, Colvilles, Spokanes, and Coeur d'Alenes. Living in small villages and encampments, these Indians hunted, fished, and gathered roots, seeds, and berries. Their spiritual beliefs were connected to the mysteries of the natural world that surrounded them. After 1730, Columbia Plateau tribes acquired the horse, and with that, their lifestyle changed dramatically. Now they could travel greater distances and successfully hunt big game such as the buffalo. In time, however, the range of the annual hunts by the Salish tribes penetrated the traditional lands of the Blackfeet and Crow Indians, and these trespasses created war and turmoil among all the tribes. When the first white fur traders came to explore the Rocky Mountains, the Salish experienced new difficulties. Their enemies traded furs to white men for guns and used these weapons to intimidate peaceful tribes. In addition, their villages were defenseless against smallpox epidemics carried by some white men. Staggered by these dramatic changes, Salish chieftains listened eagerly to the words of visiting Iroquois Indians who told the Salish about a powerful spiritual medicine offered by a special breed of white men called Black Robes. The headmen became convinced that these special medicine men with the Big Prayer, or Catholic Mass, would make them more powerful than their enemies and protect them from harm. Several Salish tribes dispatched expeditions to St. Louis, the home of the Black Robes, with an appeal for help. Happily, in 1839, the fourth delegation encountered Father Peter John de Smet at Council Bluffs on the Missouri River. Father de Smet was a member of the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, a religious order of Catholic men with special interests in missionary work and education. After learning the Indians' goal, de Smet envisioned an empire of Christian Indians in the recesses of the Rocky Mountains. He begged his superiors to honor the Indians' request for a missionary, and they did not refuse. As a result, in 1841, de Smet himself established St. Mary's Mission for the Flathead Indians in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, the first Jesuit mission in the Pacific Northwest. Meantime, Salish tribes on the western side of the Rocky Mountains, such as the Coeur d'Alenes, wanted their own black robe and mission. De Smet himself answered the call of the Coeur d'Alenes, visiting them in the land they called Chichuamsh, which means the found place. In 1842, de Smet sent Father Nicholas Point to the Coeur d'Alenes to lay out the second Jesuit mission on the St. Joe River at the lower end of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Father Point was the first Euro-American artist to portray scenes from the lives of the Salish people. Here he depicts some of the games played by the Indians. Flooding and other natural hazards continued to plague this spot. Therefore, in the spring of 1846, the Jesuits and Indians relocated their mission 35 miles away, selecting this time a grassy knoll above the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. The new site overlooked both fields and marshes and had a spectacular view of the adjacent mountains. The first mission buildings consisted of a small chapel, a modest barn, and 3 crude log houses. Before long, the ravages of nature prompted the Jesuits to draft plans for a set of permanent buildings, especially a church. The plans for a church accelerated in 1850 with the appointment of Father Anthony Ravalle to the Coeur d'Alene Mission of the Sacred Heart. Beloved by the Flathead Indians, with whom he had previously toiled as the architect and builder of St. Mary's Mission, Ravalle approached the building of a new mission church with characteristic energy and ingenuity. For nearly 6 years, Father Ravalle and the Coeur d'Alene Indians worked tirelessly to construct a magnificent church 90 feet long and 40 feet wide, modeled along classical Roman Doric lines. Carefully, Indian carpenters drilled holes into the upright beams with primitive augers, then secured them to 10-inch square rafters by means of precisely whittled wooden pegs. A lattice work of small sapling sticks fastened together horizontally between the large upright timbers formed the interior walls of the church. Next, River grass was woven between the rods and caulked with mud in the wattle and daub technique of the day. Later, when newspapers became available, they were glued to the walls and painted to resemble wallpaper. Hand-hewn planks shaped by a broadaxe served as floorboards. 17 wooden panels, some stained blue with huckleberry juice to resemble the color of the sky, formed a beautiful ceiling. Father Ravalli demonstrated his skill as an artist as well as an architect by creating several beautiful furnishings for Sacred Heart Church. He used a simple pocket knife to fashion European-style chandeliers from used tin cans. He also carved a main altar, 2 side altars, and several statues from pine logs, sealing each with a hot paint mixture which, when dry, resembled veined marble. In addition, he painted devotional pictures. To the Jesuits, the Coeur d'Alene mission of the Sacred Heart served as a symbol of Christianity, civilization, and Euro-American values on the frontier. Only those Indians who lived exemplary lives were permitted to assist in the construction of what the Coeur d'Alenes called the House of the Great Spirit. This participation strengthened their belief in what the Church represented, and therefore made it easier to adopt Christian teachings. The Coeur d'Alenes found the Jesuits' religion not only attractive to them, but also similar in several ways to their own traditional beliefs. Both, for example, shared a sense of the miraculous. The Holy Family and the saints, so lovingly depicted in the devotional style of 19th century Catholic art, were looked upon by the Indians as powers who could grant favors and protection, just as did native spirit helpers. The crucifix, holy medals, and rosaries of the Jesuits paralleled sacred charms and other medicines used by the Indians. Gregorian chants sung by the priests were not unlike tribal prophecy songs. The incense burned at Mass seemed to the Indians closely related to the smoke of sage and tobacco that carried their own prayers skyward. Louise Sui Huyen, the daughter of a Coeur d'Alene chief, was one of the most notable natives at the mission. She assisted in the teaching of Christianity, nursed the sick, and cared for the elderly and young alike. In time, a number of Indians took up residence on the mission grounds, and some began to cultivate the land. The Jesuits encouraged agriculture and education among the Indians, even providing them with various tools and implements. Guns were used for hunting, not warfare. Some Coeur d'Alenes, however, did not abandon their own traditions for those of the white man. They retained an interest in their traditional hunting lands and continued to live their life cycle according to the seasonal food sources. During this time, the mission also began to serve as a rest station and rendezvous for the increasing numbers of soldiers, miners, and pioneers traveling west in search of wealth and new lands. Alarmed by the numbers of white adventurers invading their lands, in 1858 the Coeur d'Alene Indians and several neighboring tribes struck out at these invaders in an effort to protect their ancient territory. A bloody war followed in which both sides turned their anger against each other. Father Joseph Josette, a Jesuit with long experience at Sacred Heart Mission, used his diplomatic skills to secure peace between the Coeur d'Alenes and the United States Army. The treaty was signed at Sacred Heart Mission between Colonel George Wright and Chief Vincent and his headmen, with Father Josette presiding as interpreter. 2 years later, the Mullen Road reached Sacred Heart Mission and provided another intrusion into the life of the Coeur d'Alenes and the Jesuit priests. Connecting Fort Benton on the Missouri River with Fort Walla Walla on the Columbia, The Mullen Road passed directly in front of Sacred Heart Mission. In recognition of its assistance to many weary and destitute emigrant travelers, Captain John Mullen pronounced the mission a St. Bernard-like monastery in the Coeur d'Alene Mountains. The Mullen Road opened the Pacific Northwest to even more pioneers than had come before the Coeur d'Alene War in 1858. Times were changing rapidly in Idaho Territory, but never more so than when the government established boundaries for a Coeur d'Alene Indian reservation, and, much to the shock of the Indians, Sacred Heart Mission was not included. Consequently, in 1877, the Jesuits and the Indians relocated Sacred Heart Mission 60 miles away at a place named for Father de Smet. Understandably, many Indians were heartsick to be forcibly removed from the house of the Great Spirit. A Coeur d'Alene spokesman, Augustine, expressed a common sentiment when he asked, "Have we then to leave this beautiful church, which we have built with our own hands, and which has given us the knowledge of God? Must we leave these woods, which have supplied us with firewood and with game, this prairie which has fed our horses, this river which has given us the trout and the beaver?" A new Sacred Heart Mission and church rose quickly at De Smet, Idaho. Regrettably, fire destroyed the church in 1939. The rebuilt church is similar to Father Ravalli's original design. After 1877, the massive log church on the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River became known as the Old Mission. Most of the Indians were gone, but Father Joseph Cataldo, superior of the Rocky Mountain Missions of the Society of Jesus, made it his administrative headquarters. Eventually, the Union Pacific Railroad located a station about a mile from Old Mission, and the town site was named Cataldo in honor of this pioneer priest. The mining boom of the 1880s brought yet another massive migration to North Idaho. Some miners took steamboats across Lake Coeur d'Alene to the Mission Landing. Others came by railroad. In time, most of the buildings at Old Mission fell into disrepair. Even so, the church remained a silent landmark in the mountains. While the great church remained the central symbol of Old Mission, the parish house was home to both residential and visiting Jesuits. Fires destroyed the first two parish houses, but a new, durable parish house was constructed in 1887 using a popular neo-Gothic design. For many years, the Jesuits from Gonzaga University ministered to the needs of the inhabitants living in the rough mining towns of North Idaho, like Burke and Wallace. They used the parish house as a way station on their travels to and from Spokane. For a short period, at the turn of the century, the parish house was also used to train novices seeking to become Jesuit brothers. With the assistance of these willing workers, the mission produced up to 500 tons of hay annually, a large portion of which was sold to the cavalry units at Fort Sherman in Coeur d'Alene. The parish house also offered hospitality to travelers. The Jesuits used the parlor as a library and conference room. The kitchen served 3 meals a day at 2 sittings. The parish house had its own chapel for use by the Jesuits for parish and private services, especially when it was unreasonable to heat up the large church. The second floor of the building had 2 bedrooms that normally slept 5 or 6 Jesuits. In 1909, the Jesuits retreated in the face of limited financial resources and left Old Mission. During this time, Sunday excursions to the Old Mission provided excitement and entertainment to many families from the Coeur d'Alene, Spokane area. The romantic history of the building intrigued many, but still the buildings deteriorated. Old Mission aged ungracefully after World War I. Vandals built fires on the floor, carried away artifacts, and wrote on the walls. Fortunately, the parish house and the church were both still standing in 1925. when North Idaho businessmen unveiled a formal plan for restoration of the mission church. An automobile pilgrimage the next year attracted some 2,000 participants and regenerated interest in the old mission. Many Coeur d'Alene Indians were also present, as was 90-year-old Father Cataldo, who spoke to the Indians in their language. By 1930, enough money had been raised to restore the church to its former glory. Every effort was made to preserve the quaint architecture. In the process, the old parish house was moved 50 feet away from the church as a fire prevention measure. Once again, Sacred Heart Mission became a destination for tourists and visitors. For several decades, priests from the Catholic Diocese of Boise used the parish house, and a caretaker lived at the old mission. In 1962, Old Mission was designated a National Historic Landmark. A decade later, in 1973-74, Old Mission underwent its second major renovation, this time under the supervision of the Idaho Bicentennial Commission. The common goal was to restore the church back to its original appearance of the 1850s and 1860s. Professional workmen installed a new rock foundation for the church. They reconstructed portions of the 6 columns, and they replaced the 4 urns in the front of the building. The ancient exterior clapboard siding was removed and replaced, and the roof and flooring were reinforced. In 1975, the site was dedicated as a state historic park. The present-day visitor center was built in 1979 to house interpretive displays. The parish house, meanwhile, received its own renovation in 1986-87 through funds raised by the Old Mission Associates. The interpretive exhibit followed 2 years later. Today, Old Mission State Park is visited by thousands of people each year. Travelers come from distant places to marvel at the oldest standing building in the state of Idaho, an architectural wonder. Annually, the Coeur d'Alene Indians make a pilgrimage on the Feast of the Assumption in August. They are just one of many cultural and educational groups who make Old Mission part of a living history. As you explore Old Mission State Park, perhaps you too will be enveloped by the same spirit and energy that was present at this site more than a century ago, a time when Sacred Heart Mission was the Coeur d'Alene Indians' house of the Great Spirit.